Agriculture in this country in particular has become so efficient that food production is not an issue that many of us think about. But issues like climate change, inflation, and the war in Ukraine are changing that. And if you have any doubts about what that could do, even though they're not food production related, think about empty toilet paper shelves and what's happening with the current crisis in baby formula. At a recent NACD climate workshop I attended, I heard one panelist even predict that food companies would need to begin to bring ag expertise into the boardroom in response to these issues. So our panel today will explore some of the ways the future of food is relevant to both you and your companies. And I hope that you can all take a little something away about how you can affect change, how you can take personal action. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Mohan Tavarath, and he will introduce the panel. So I've known Mohan for a number of years. I actually met him at an NACD summit at one of the first ag panels that they had. Mohan is a seasoned board director, investor, and technology executive, and he's currently a partner at International Farming Corporation. He has invested in and led companies that have been recognized by the Inc. 500, Goldman Sachs Top 100, Deloitte Tech Fast 500, and Y Combinator. He chaired the board of a data analytics firm from startup through acquisition a few years ago by a global top 5 biotech and ag company. Previously, Mr. Tavarath was CEO of a fintech company in California that was one of the fastest growing private companies in the US for several years. He has previously served in various executive, management, and consulting roles at KPMG, MetLife, General Electric, Waltz Group, Morgan Stanley, and AIG. Mohan is a board leadership fellow with NACD, and he graduated from Columbia University in New York with an MBA on the Dean's List and holds master's and bachelor's degrees in computer science with distinction from the University of Pune in India. And with that, I will turn the program over to Mohan's capable hands.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm honored to be hosting and moderating this panel on food and ag, and appreciate all of you taking time out from your busy schedules to come and listen to us talk about this topic. I'd like to begin by introducing fellow speakers over here. I'll begin with Chris Rowley. Chris is the CEO and founder of Harvest Returns, an online equity crowdfunding platform designed specifically for investing in the agriculture industry. They facilitate capital raises for small to medium-sized farmers and ranchers in sustainable farming businesses. Chris had a distinguished 29-year military career, thank you for your service, and is now a captain in the Navy Reserve, serving as the Reserve Chief of Staff for the United States 6th Fleet. He has had management roles at Jones Lang LaSalle, Electronic Data Systems, L3Com, and Blackbird Technologies. Raleigh holds a degree from Texas A&M, is an Aggie, is a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College, and received his MBA at George Washington University. Thank you, Chris. We have here Anne Greven. Wanted to make sure you got the Dutch pronunciation right. Was that close?
Yeah, that was very good.
All right, excellent. So Anne is the global head of food and agribusiness innovation and the Food Bites platform at Rabobank. Food Bites drives collaboration between startups, corporate leaders, and investors to develop solutions to food system challenges. So she's driving innovation at a very large bank. That's a really, really invigorating experience,
really
right?
Punjab, best
Really
Punjab.
Punjab, exactly. So she has prioritized developing relationships with the best and brightest startups and entrepreneurs from around the world, and brings innovative and actionable ideas to major food and ag companies. She's previously held roles as both the head of acquisition, finance, and as managing director, co-head of capital markets at Rabobank. So, Anne, thank you for being here. And then Jackson Takich is the chief economist and head of strategy, research, and analytics at Farmer Mac. Is a Kentucky native whose strong ties to agriculture began growing up in a rural town in Kentucky. He joined the Farmer Mac team in 2005 and has worked in various roles: strategy, research, credit, underwriting. Has written a book on and is a creator of The Feed, a quarterly publication on the agriculture sector. And he holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Centre College, a master's degree in agriculture economics from Purdue, and a master's in business administration, and a master's degree in finance from Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. All right, excellent. So thank you for joining, Jackson. So without further ado, we wanted to get into some of the topics, but I think Sarah already talked a little bit about why food and ag. Why is this important? And there's probably a few ways we can frame this out. In the late 1700s, and because of our roles in boards, there was one question that has become very famous. A certain person was asked, "We don't have food, we don't have bread. What can you do for us?" And her answer was, "If you don't have bread, eat cake." Right, so that was a disconnect from what the regular average person in France was dealing with at the time. And so where we are in the boardroom, with a combination of all the macro factors happening in the space, we have to be very cognizant, even if we are not in the industry. We may not be in the industry, but we participate in it. 100% market share, we all eat, and we take it for granted sometimes. So just as a quick question, let's take farmland, that is cropland, and pasture land. Taking millions of square kilometers, how much do you think cropland is required to feed the global population today? I guess. I would have started with thousands or 100,000, but if somebody had to take a guess in the audience. 1 million? All right, that's a good number. Anyone want to go higher or lower? 16 million square kilometers for just cropland to generate the amount of food we eat globally every year. That's the size of South America. Pasture land for all the meat and different meat derivative products. How many square million kilometers? 30. That's the size of Africa. So when we think about resources and put it in that perspective, it's about 30% of greenhouse gases are used up by agriculture, and a very large amount of the water is also used up there. And you see that happening with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act coming in California, which is the largest ag-producing state. It's known for Silicon Valley, but it generates more agricultural revenue than Iowa and Nebraska combined, which are the number 2 and number 3 crop-producing states. So that's just framing out the context, and there are many things we can talk about: sustainability, ESG, societal impact, carbon, so on, but that's kind of the broad spectrum. So with that, I think I'll go to carbon and ESG. You know, carbon is beginning to become more and more visible in the boardroom. For food and ag, it's very fundamental. And the question is, how real is carbon? How do you measure it? What's the science behind it? Are there exchanges? Are there environmental credits? How does a bank like Rabobank, with the huge amount of market share it has with growers globally, how do you drive that and make it real for a farmer who just wants to grow, tend the crop, harvest, and get a good price and be able to put their children through college?
God, that's a lot. Rabobank, for those who don't know, we are a Dutch bank, so we are rooted in also having a mission because we're a cooperative bank. There are not many cooperative banks. And this backdrop will go on to answer your question in a minute. But the relevance to that is we are a very small country. We're the size of equivalent to Rhode Island. And that's relevant because we're also surrounded by a lot of water. So we've had to take, as a country, a lot of sustainability measures to, one, preserve our country so that it's not flooded, but also to be efficient in order of feeding our own people, because we live basically in a swamp. Most of our country is underwater, but with our dike system and all that. So we are rooted by farmers who actually have been solving these problems as a course of the way they live their life in the Netherlands for hundreds of years. The relationship that that we have with the farming community is so deeply rooted in the core of what we do that as the UN was identifying all the challenges facing climate change and recognizing that agriculture was a big component, Rabobank quickly stepped in and said, we need to show leadership. And we showed leadership in several ways, but one of the things we did in the last 3 years is set up a carbon bank. And we've talked a lot about this, Mohan and I. What does that mean? And our hope is that carbon becomes sort of almost a currency in and of itself that actually can help put money back into farmers' pockets by allowing us to capture, measure, and actually use that as a way of offsets. And some of that's going on now. If any of you have flown Delta recently, I use Delta because they'll tell you if your flight is carbon neutral, which is something none of us ever thought about. And that is they're buying offsets from either farmers or other offset producers so in order to make those claims. There's going to be a lot of change. There's going to be a lot of noise around this because are we truly measuring it correctly? What are the modes? How are we actually accounting for this? So all of those things are being developed in a hyper fast way. And so this is going to become a new way of banking. And that's what we're betting on. We've also created a project called Acorn, and it's very big in Africa, where we're actually incentivizing smallholder farmers to plant trees, because the biggest challenge in Africa right now is maintaining soil in the lands that are fertile. And the best way to do that is to have trees. Trees are also great offsets for carbon, So we have a program where we're paying them to plant trees. They put sensors on it that we're able to capture the carbon that's being sequestered by these trees. And they are actually able to use those credits. And as a smallholder farmer, that is making a big impact. We believe that this project will, continue to grow, and that's how we're going to build a carbon future, where carbon is now a currency, and it puts more money in the hands of the farmers, which we know is relevant.
Jackson, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a great summary. It's one of these things that I think we've been talking about sustainability. We've been talking about carbon. We've been talking about a lot of these things for a decade now. And to actually see some of these things start to come to fruition where we're actually doing calculations, we're actually seeing some standards start to take shape, that's going to be a big driver of change, particularly all the way back down to the farmer. That's where Farmer Mac operates a lot is at the farm level. We're a secondary market for agricultural real estate. And so we're very interested in what's going on in that soil because that could be the collateral for a 30-year fixed rate farm loan. So as we start to see these standards take shape and as we see carbon banks like Rabo's start to take form, then you can start to build financial products around them that farmers could start to use. Until we have those standards, it becomes very difficult to have a financial product tied to, say, carbon sequestration or regenerative practice. So really exciting to see in the secondary market space that start to take shape, and that's what's going to really be a tipping point, I think, for financial products to help support these practices. More and more players can sometimes crowd the field, and we may have multiple standards coming through. But I know the USDA has spent a lot of time and money trying to focus on what are the right standards around carbon sequestration or around carbon capture and soil health. And I think that's going to drive a lot of standardization as well.
Thank you. It's an attempt to capture an externality in economic model.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, two things on the carbon market, maybe from the producer perspective. We talk to a lot of farmers and ranchers all the time, and they are interested in these markets, and they're mostly interested in it. Obviously, they want to do the right thing and support the reduction in climate and improve their soil, but they also are looking at it as a way to become more profitable. And so what Rabobank is doing and the other trading markets and platforms are very interesting. But I have 2 points. One is it's non-trivial to measure the carbon. So it's rather, and the scale of doing that is interesting, whether it's remote sensors or sensors in situ or some sort of out there soil testings. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And as Jackson said, there's not a lot of standardization now. And the second piece is I'm personally interested to see how this market endures a recession, because if the offsets, something's going to have to get cut as oil companies or any other company, the airlines or anybody who's getting their margins tightened, something's going to be cut. And is it going to be their carbon offsets. And if it is, I think farmers are going to be very leery of putting too much investment into this on their own land, because they may not see a return. Go ahead.
I think that's a really good point you're raising. I think the one thing that I would say is that a lot of like the large corporates have committed to certain ESG requirements. And many of them, whether they're joining COP26 or not, are recognizing that their shareholders are now more than ever looking for some sort of governance and action behind the governance. I think anything that can be measured and reported actually helps them. So I think the one area that we're seeing where we're starting to find measurement and reporting, that's my hope that it will become stickier, because a lot of the ESG goals are not necessarily always as attainable, and therefore they're not going to get that lift for the shareholder value if they aren't able to report it. But
Thank you. So I think that's a good frame up on that. What the next topic we want to get into is talk about sustainability. But I think as we transition to that, one of the questions we got yesterday is, how is this relevant to our industry? And so food and ag is really a manufacturing industry with a highly disaggregated supply chain, right? Very rural, very dispersed. And you bring uniformity into that, and that's one part of the challenge. The second is it's an energy industry. And because there's a great state of Texas, I think you can relate to that. It's energy for humans, right? We cannot function if we don't get energy. So that's a part of the process. It's healthcare. You heard the concept of let food be thy medicine. The cost of food as a part of our wallet share has decreased, while healthcare has increased. So there's some fundamental issues we need to look at. And just like fossil fuels, there's fossil water. The Ogallala powers a lot of the food generation across 8 to 11 states in the Midwest and in the heartland. And that is not an infinite resource. It needs to have time to recharge. And we've been depleting it slowly over time. I mean, that's the science. Now, the debate about how it's used and whether it's sustainable or not is something we'll keep off the table now. But there are fossil aquifers, and we have to make sure that they recharge enough to be able to sustain what's happening. So that transitions to our next question about sustainability. Have we passed peak sustainability? Do we have fatigue about sustainability with the consumer, or are they re-energized? Is there a balance between what corporations are looking for versus what consumers are, and how do you bridge that? And what do you see from a Farmer Mac perspective?
Yeah. Well, I certainly don't think we've passed peak sustainability. I think there's a lot of discussion left to happen. I think if I had to put it a sports metaphor, maybe third inning at latest. Because I think a lot of the discovery, we're just starting to get data now. We're starting to track practices. What do those mean for the land, for the production? How do we measure and put water to use? All of these things take a lot of time, measurement, careful study to really understand. So maybe the consumers heard the word sustainability for a while now. We've kind of that may be a charged word, but things like regenerative practices and carbon capture, and these things are coming up as more specific elements of a broader sustainability pledge. So I think we're pretty early on overall. Now, we've heard the word sustainability for a decade or more. So for sure, that word has been used and played, and I think there's a lot of charge around that particular word. But when you break down what do we mean by sustainability, it's using water for the next 1,000 years. How are we going to think about water for the next 1,000? That has real day-to-day implications. What we do today will change what the land is capable of doing, how people will bank. Will you even be insurable on a piece of land? And we're starting to see that out of California today. If you do not have demonstrated access to water rights, some insurance companies won't insure your home, your farm, your production. And that's a new thing for a lot of producers and a lot of lenders who rely on insurance as a backstop for production disruptions. So I think we're still pretty early on, and there's a lot of discovery left to happen. Yeah, we've been talking about it for a while, so maybe to the consumer it feels like, hey, weren't we just talking about sustainability a few years back? I thought we'd solve that. I think the answer to the consumer is not yet. And I think the consumer has a lot of interest in participating, but it's confusing. So until we can get some really tangible labeling, you look at organic, it really started to take off when people trusted the brand. and they got that labeling down. They trusted that the USDA was doing the measurements. They knew they were paying more for a product, but they understood what they were paying for, what that premium bought. And so that's where we are, I think, with more regenerative and sustainable practices, is how do you brand that and get the consumer to understand why they're paying perhaps a premium for that attribute.
Anne?
So are we? And I just want to clarify what we're answering. Is sustainability core to the future development of the food system, or is it core to the importance of where companies need to focus? Because I think they're not always the same, but I just want to make sure. Yes. Okay.
Actually, in fact, a quick question to the audience.
Yeah.
How important is sustainability, and is that an agenda item on your quarterly board meeting, annual board meeting, or decadal board meeting? Show of hands.
Quarterly. How many people are quarterly? Annually. And sustainability, is it more from a measurement reporting, or is it more from the hygiene factor of, how you engage in your corporate behavior? Okay. So I do think that's very telling and aligns sort of with what I was thinking, in that for many of us, individuals or who are part of more corporate organizations, sustainability, as you said, has become this word we've heard a lot about, but we're not always sure what the actions are that we are all supposed to be taking around sustainability. And so I think that is, to me, one of the key things that still needs to be defined. And we talked a little bit about this at lunch, is like, what does sustainability mean if we're using that as a differentiator in whether we're building a food system or re-engineering our food system? What is the sustainability hurdles for California? Water, absolutely. For most agricultural, it's going to be water. But, we're also going to have more water that isn't actually going to be, potable and usable. So we also have this other water challenge. So depending upon the business you're in, we have to really define sustainability. And I think that is something that we as individuals need to do for ourselves and take the actions that we personally can manage. But for companies, the one thing that I keep urging is, what is your sustainability initiative going to be, and how are you going to use that to differentiate what actions you are going to take in your organization? And it could be, rolling out non-plastics in your work streams, like no more water bottles. We talked a little bit about that. Or it could be, we are actually going to deploy greater ability for people to give back to the community. So we want to create more sustainable initiatives for our, people to go work at a food bank or clean up a park, or those are the kind of things. So what does it mean for us? And I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I think it's the defining of what the goal is.
I think from the agriculture side, sustainability is, as kind of Jackson is, it's just getting started in the past decade. Now, you could look back in other cultures in hundreds of years where we had sustainable food production, but since the 1950s, 60s, with the industrialization of agriculture, the chemistry behind agriculture, and now in the past decade, we've looked at the producers are deciding that they need to meet consumer demand, and that's really what drives all this. It's what drives profitability for the consumers, or for the producers, and that's going to be based on what the consumer demand is. So as long as that consumer demand is there for more sustainable products, there will be an outlet, no matter what methodology, for producing food in a sustainable manner. As a private company, owner of a private company, an entrepreneur, I don't have the same pressures for sustainability that some of the public companies, some of the companies that you are. But I do want to keep that top of mind, and our business happens to be focused on sustainable agriculture, and companies, investing in companies that support that. However, I'm also making profit-based decisions. So you all have to make profit-based decisions, and as the environment that we're in is very volatile right now, economically, you're going to have to reflect and see where sustainability fits in your corporate goals.
Absolutely.
Just to follow up on something, Ann, you said just about the corporate, how does the corporation respond to these sorts of things? We're seeing a lot more interest from food and non-food companies on, hey, how can we participate in these types of programs, either through green bond financing, or is there a product that would link practices financially back through? Because that's one of the things that Farmer Mac can do, is issue securities. So we're starting to see a lot more interest in certainly food and agribusiness companies wanting to participate in programs that link sustainable and regenerative practices. But even non-food companies are like, hey, we want to do something too. And is there a program or a platform that we can do that? And I think there's going to be more and more of that as people start to define what those goals are and what problems they're trying to solve. Is, hey, I know I want to do something. Help me find an avenue to do that in an effective and efficient way. And there's just a lot more of that discovery happening right now, and it's exciting to see.
Thank you, Jackson. So let's take a slightly different angle on sustainability and bring the free markets in. A show of hands. How many of you would be concerned if food prices went up 10%? 50%? 100%? 300%? All right. So the sustainability piece, on all our boards, I'm sure we look at business continuity planning, disaster recovery. On vendor management, do you have diversification of your vendor supply? Even if you have one supplier that is really, really good, has scale, passes all the tests, you want to have at least 30% from another vendor, et cetera, correct? So you address that as part of your board responsibilities. Fast forward and look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. That is a war, but it's actually a food fight, literally. The eastern part of Ukraine is one of the most productive farmland globally. And Russia and Ukraine combined produce 30% of global wheat, 20% of corn, 80% of sunflower oil. And that being jammed up, not having enough storage and shipping because of the blockade, is going to impact food prices globally. So we might think, oh, we're in America and we produce enough. We've got the Midwest. We've got all these rich producing regions. That's one part. The second is inputs. The fertilizer and other inputs that go into growing food, Russia and Belarus are in the top 5 of every major category. And if at all you wanted to add China and Taiwan, God forbid, in the mix, then China is one of those. You've got 3 of the top 5 suppliers. Sanctions constraints are going to have an impact. So this is building up. So it's another way of saying there's an economic aspect to sustainability, that if food prices were to go up above a certain level, it's going to have an impact on everyone. And even if we are privileged over here to be able to afford it, it's going to cause social unrest. And that in some way or the other is going to turn around and come back. So the sustainability piece, while until now has been a good catchword, marketing departments have been applied to it, and a lot of actual good work has been going against it, nothing accelerates it than an actual change in the real world in kind of a supply-demand parameter. So that's one part of sustainability. So on that theme, getting into, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, but then linking it to capitalism. Chris, with your company, how are you reinventing capitalism for farmland investing or in the food and ag business? How do you make it real? And for a farmer, they're just trying to grow. And then they're being asked to digitize, to add traceability, to add ESG, to add water measurements, track inputs, nitrogen, et cetera. So how are you tackling that, and how do you see it evolving yourself?
Yeah. Hey, first I want to thank NACD for having us here, and your organization is important to entrepreneurs like me, because my entire board is composed of people that have a relationship with NACD. So what you're doing is helping small and large companies. So appreciate that. Harvest Returns, we're an investment platform, and you know, I'm not trying to sell you here, but what I sell investors is what are the compelling reasons to invest in agriculture, and there's a couple. The first is demographics. The population is going to continue to rise. 2050, we're going to have estimates between 9 and 10 billion people on the planet. As populations tend to grow in affluency, they tend to consume more calories. So the amount of food that we're going to have to produce in the next 20 to 30 years to meet these caloric demands is going to continue to increase. And so at the same time, we have to produce that food sustainably. And that's the crux of why we're here. And from as I think everybody, I can say safely, everybody in here is fairly affluent. You can make choices, your personal choices. I'm going to buy food locally, and local is one of those things that we're really into, local produced food. And I'll talk maybe later on about some of the trends I see. But you can make corporate choices. You can serve grass-finished beef in your corporate cafeteria, and you can invest and sustain and support these farmers. And for us, we see a lot of interesting technology that's coming into the production of food. But the problem with you have to show them. Farmers by kind of nature are very conservative people, and they tend to do what worked for their multi-generational farmers, and most of the farmers in the United States are multi-generational. They tend to do what worked for their fathers and grandmothers or what the guy down the road does because it works. So when you bring a new technology to them, you have to show them what the ROI is, and they're not going to invest in that technology unless you can show them it's going to make them more money. It's going to grab them a bigger piece of market share. And so Ann's company works with a lot of ag tech folks. We work with some, and these companies are great. The farmers can't always afford what they're doing, so that's where we come in. We help adequately capitalize some of these startup farming enterprises, whether it's indoor ag or they're doing permanent crops or whatever they're doing, to be able to acquire some of this technology to produce their own products more sustainably. And I'd say, the other thing is, as influencers in this room, we can also, encourage our boards and our companies and our social circles to look at the sustainability and not only the way our companies, but our personal buying choices. What was the last bit?
Are consumers willing to pay more?
Yeah. So the affluent people are going to pay more. I mean, it's good food tends to be a luxury item, right? So it's like Gucci and Prada. Regardless of what the recession happens, people are going to go out and buy luxury goods. And I think the same thing is said with some of the niche agricultural products, whether it's organic or locally produced, grass-fed, grass-finished. We like that. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that that food insecurity is a problem, and it's going to be. We're going to see that because of the input prices, because of the war, because of the supply chain disruptions. We're going to see that. While we might be able to go out and have a nice grass-fed steak in the fall in North Africa, somebody's going to be lucky to be able to purchase a loaf of bread to feed their family. So and North Africa, by the way, consumes most of the wheat products that are exported out of Ukraine. So I think we're going to see. Also, it's that arc of instability in the Maghreb. We're going to see some interesting, hopefully not terrible geopolitical ramifications here in the next 18 months or so because of these food shortages. But we have to make those decisions to be able to sustain the food system, grow our food sustainably, grow an ever amount of calories, and do it. And one way we can do that is with our dollars, our investment dollars and our corporate dollars.
Thank you. So you can use, there's context on your table for if you want to send in questions. It's very high-tech. Becky made sure it all works. So if you have questions, please feel free to send them in using the app. To round out sustainability, let's look at, like the Colorado River. How much of the Colorado River do you think flows into the ocean today? Zero. It doesn't flow in. How many of you are familiar with the Colorado River Compact? So that's very much like a securitization. There are 6 basin states for the Colorado River. The top 3 and the bottom 3, there's 9 million acre feet, and California gets 4.5 million acre feet. Which means that, and like Arizona as an example has 1 million or 1.5 million, et cetera, all the way up to Colorado. So if the Colorado ever dries up enough that there's only 4.5 million acre feet of water flowing, the 5 states that are upstream have to let the water stream down, and California gets to use that. So it's just like a securitization strip in, tranching mechanism in the financial capital markets. So this is very real. And there's a term, they say, whiskey is for drinking, water's for fighting. So there are very deep implications of sustainability that we've had a 70-year period since World War II of relative calm. But what we're seeing over here with what's happening with Ukraine, it's a combination of 3 dislocations that happen one after the other within a 3 or 4 year period. You had the trade wars, then you had the pandemic, and then you've got what's happening in Ukraine. So this can become quite serious. And the summer, you can see food prices going up. I think Anne already thinks that it's going to go up quite a bit. 50% is your bet. So there are going to be very large-scale ramifications, so it's going to affect everybody in every industry. And that's why this is very, very real. So with that, I'll see if we have any questions. But while we're doing that, there are a few trends. And we all go to different conferences. We participate in the industry. So I'm going to request each of the speakers over here, what are the top 3 either overhyped or underhyped trends? Are they real? And are they going to stay, or are they going to fizzle out? So maybe starting with you, Jackson.
Okay, this is one of those cases where it's better to go first, right? Because then you get to pick and choose which ones you do. Maybe I won't do all 3. We'll do one each. Yeah. And then we can. Yeah. One of the things that I'm really tracking is protein alternatives. So the use of either plant-based proteins in replacement for animal-based proteins, or probably even more, it's not even cutting edge anymore, but cell-based. So growing protein in a giant bioreactor and then serving it up as a chicken nugget or some other format. Starting to get some, it's kind of like it's ebbs and flows, but there's a lot of money chasing both of those alternatives to animal-based protein. We talk about how many hectares you need of pasture ground just to make beef, to make a pound of beef. It's a lot, and it's a lot of resources. So what I think a lot of investors are chasing is, can we do that with different inputs and do it for less? And plant-based proteins got a huge jump start with Impossible and Beyond. I'm sure everyone's seen that on a menu somewhere. If you've driven through McDonald's, I have 2 kids. We go through McDonald's a fair amount. You start to see things like that popping up at Burger King. Had an Impossible Whopper for a while. I grew up and it was basically one type of veggie burger, and now I'm starting to see plant-based proteins at Starbucks. They have, a Beyond or an Impossible breakfast sandwich. So a tremendous amount of money chasing that and trying to convince the consumer that this is either a healthy alternative to meat or it's a more sustainably produced protein compared to an animal-based protein. So a lot of money, a lot of interest tracking both of those. The cell-based technology is really interesting. It's super expensive just to make a bioreactive a chicken nugget, but it's coming down in price. And what that does, essentially just takes the same stuff that you would feed through a cow or a chicken, soy-based or corn-based products, and it creates, they structure proteins and make it look and taste and smell like chicken. It's still expensive to make a pound, $20 or $30 a pound, right, to be able to produce this, as opposed to pennies for traditional agriculture. But as that gets cheaper, will we start to see more people willing to take that plunge? In China, Singapore, that it's actually on some menus, I think now. You're starting to see that become, at least in the public. USDA and FDA have not yet approved that human consumption of those cell-based proteins yet, but I anticipate in the next 12 months they probably will take a look at it, because it takes a lot less carbon to make a pound of that. Even though it's more expensive to do, it produces less in greenhouse gases. So these are all things that if consumers are willing to buy it, I think there's a lot of money, investor interest chasing it, and it could really change the way we think about proteins in this country and then globally, because a lot of the first thing that people do when you give them an extra dollar in a foreign market is they buy meat. That's what they want to do. That's a very good use of calories. And can you do that cheaper with fewer inputs? And plant-based and cell-based may offer some of those alternative options. So that's what I'm tracking, and I'm seeing a lot more momentum and especially investor money pouring into it. And if you follow the money, sometimes you can pick up a trend or two.
Thank you. And just for context, 1 pound of beef uses about 2,000 gallons of water. 1 pound of lentils, which is high protein, is 50 gallons of water. So that's the differential. So eventually it's like just like any portfolio, there needs to be diversification. It's not all or nothing. And that's, again, the market is going to help define that. And
What is the one trend we're following, right?
that is either overhyped and sustainable.
Okay. So I would say the biggest thing, and you touched on it a little bit, so hopefully I'm not stealing yours, is that we see a lot about data. You know, we're going to track your data. We're going to become better, smarter, faster farmers because we're going to have all this data and we're going to measure all this data. The biggest problem with all this data is it doesn't aggregate. And the biggest challenge that we have with these data capturing technologies is they aren't really driving better decisions yet. And anybody who's a data capturer will tell you that. It's like, because the data changes, it needs to be constantly, you know, to have AI decision making, you need to have, you know, a lot of data coming in. It all needs to be aggregated, and decisions need to be applying multiple different tiers. So we are much farther away to making smarter decisions than all the aggregating, capturing technologies want you to believe. I think it's doable. I think it is a future for us. I think some of the bigger players probably won't be agricultural companies. They will likely be the tech companies that you know, because they're really good at capturing and aggregating. So that's, I think, the thing that I'm still waiting to see evolve in a smarter way to make it more efficient. Because right now, one system in its box isn't enough.
Okay, so can I start out with the overhyped? So my overhyped is Jackson's. I'm a beef guy, so I'm a meat guy, and I do. He's 100% right. There is a lot of money, a lot of VC money, a lot of institutional money flowing into alternative proteins, and I think at the same time, I think there's some narratives around livestock production that have been a little bit distorted, primarily from the people that are trying to get some traction in the alternative protein space. Not all beef is evil. Beef can be grown, produced, raised very regeneratively. You know, there's a reason that they sell Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat at junk food places, because it's junk. There's like 18 ingredients in an Impossible Burger, and it's all, you know, you look at it, it's a chemistry set. And think about what the supply chain is. So yes, it's grown on farms. Hopefully they're sustainable farms, but you bring all those in and you put it through industrial processes and you create the burger. So, and I think there's like 26 ingredients in a Beyond Meat. So there is some future there in alternative. We've actually invested in a microalgae production farm. So it actually doesn't taste bad. It's pretty good. So I'm not, and it's very clean. It's very clean, and it takes very little water to produce. So I'm not anti-alternative protein, although I'm not going to eat insects. Don't make me eat bugs. But it might be good cattle food or livestock food, though. As far as the underappreciated. For us, it's indoor agriculture. So indoor agriculture takes a lot of farm, and it's part of a trend that I call the decentralization and deglobalization of the food chain. Right now, we ate those salads for lunch. There's like a very high likelihood those lettuce was grown in Salinas Valley, California, because that's about where 80% of the lettuce that we eat is all grown in California. California's got water shortages. They've got labor shortages. At the same time, we can start to pull some of that. Sorry if you're a Californian, but we can start to pull some of that production out of California, grow in places where you normally couldn't grow fruits or vegetables 365 days a year, grow roughly the same yield from 1 acre of indoor agriculture that you can do on 10 acres of field-grown agriculture. You know, depending on what kind of system you're using, use 80 to 90% less water without the runoffs, without the pesticides that are flowing into the river sheds, that are flowing into the ocean, creating the red tide, killing all the fish. So Same thing on a marine protein side. We've also invested in some recirculating aquaculture systems where you're basically creating salmon or other marine fish or shrimp indoors, close to where it's consumed on the East Coast, in the middle of land, places where it wouldn't normally be grown. And the Netherlands they are the breadbasket of Europe, and part of the reason is because they've got a lot of greenhouses and they're very good. Their technology is amazing, and that technology is starting to make its way into the U.S. as well as some Israeli technology for indoor production. So we like that space. It remains to be seen if a profitable model can be created. A lot of VC money is chasing big indoor productions, whether it's like App Harvest has got big glass greenhouses, or Bright Farms or Aero Farms, or different types of indoor production. We also like the small vertical farms, because I'm trying to find the Ray Kroc of vertical farms who can produce a sort of franchise method that can be replicated across the country and grow locally sustainably produced food that we can all enjoy at a reasonable price point.
Can I say one thing? I think one of the things that, even hearing the different opinions, is that the truth is it's complicated.
Yes.
It's complex. And I think indoor farming is going to be absolutely going to grow in its importance in more municipalities. It will be a faster way to deliver food. Imagine you don't have to ship food from Salinas Valley to here, let alone all of our lettuce in New York. Most of it comes from there as well. So those will be solutions. And I do think that the next generation doesn't necessarily have the same relationship with proteins the way we have grown up with. So I also think generational changes are influencing what's happening in the alternative proteins more than we're not that consumer. We aren't, so I think that that's also changing. Those are the one comments I was going to make.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions beginning to come in, but I think while we're talking about that on data, so there's still a long runway to be able to use data effectively for what you were talking about, Anne, because it's kind of saying you're going to sell an SAP or PeopleSoft or Oracle system to the corner store 7-Eleven franchisee and expect them to be the data integrator. It doesn't work that way. A grower is really focused on growing. And just for broadacre crops as an example, you've got so many layers of data. You've got soil fertility, because if you've got a large field, they'll have different concentrations of nutrients, right? So phosphorus, nitrogen, phosphates, etc. So you take soil samples and you determine what it is, and you do variable rate. So just like a doctor, you come up with a variable rate prescription that says when you're applying fertilizer, you don't just apply blanket rate. If it's already got nitrogen, put less. If it's got less, put more. And the applicator needs to know that. So that's the soil layer. Then you've got water application. You've got disease and pest management. That's one of the reasons why California is so good for agriculture, because desert climate means you have a lot less disease and pest pressure. So you're tackling all of that, and you have to monitor it real time across a very large acreage. And then even when you're harvesting, a lot of the combines have GPS technology, so they're actually creating a map that says, here's the actual bushels per acre and which parts are more productive or not. So these are multiple layers. You can use satellite imagery and remote sensing by using near infrared and multispectral imaging. You're bouncing it off, you're seeing the biomass, and that's a proxy for how well the crop is growing based on growing degree days and crop stage and crop health, etc. So now you've got all these layers. It's like a pancake, a stack of pancakes. And then you have to be able to match all that up and work. But the real world happens. The combine breaks down, the monitor is not working, it's expensive. So there's a lot of work in this. So there's even when you're trying to measure sustainably, there's a lot of work trying to do that just in row crops. And the same happens with specialty crops, for which you can do that. So we have a question that has come in. Luxury goods are likely to survive, but what industries will become the most threatened by reductions in disposable income? So do you want to take that first, Anne, from a bank perspective?
So what's likely to fall away?
Yeah, which industries?
Well, I think just we've seen it even in the financial reporting today. Dick's Sporting Goods, for example, what were they down? 50% quarter over quarter. Target down, I think, another 40% year. So those, a lot of people spend a lot of time beautifying their home, investing in their home. All of those purchases will be delayed. So those hard good purchases, do I need a new ski parker? Do I need a new, basketball shorts? I think there's a big basketball game tonight. So these are the things that people are delaying, and it's already starting to show up. And I think that the people who are buying luxury goods are not necessarily the same people who are going to have the same impact as the 80% of the economy, and those are consumable goods such as clothing. They'll be buying less. We're already seeing the biggest growth in clothing has been in used clothing. The companies, the Real, and all of those companies who've been able to create models around using and reducing waste, those companies are going to do well. Conventionals are not going to.
Yeah. I'll just talk to our industry. There are definitely going to be choices made on the food side, and consumers are going to look to save and substitute where they can to save money on feeding their families. And if that means buying less organic or less non-GMO or those sorts of products, that's going to happen. And at the same time, on the conventional production agriculture, we have to have both. To feed the world, we have to have conventional, chemical-based, GMO-based, especially in the developing parts of the world. We have to have that type of agriculture. So are we going to see a wholesale shift? I don't think so. I think we're still going to see the progress towards more sustainable production here in the U.S. and Europe, at least, will continue to move forward as we face a recessionary period, but it might slow things down a little bit.
I think organics will continue to decline, period. I think organic is overhyped, under-confirmed, under-delivered. Most of what you get that you think is organic is not. And so I think the consumer will learn that, and people will no longer be paying that premium. But I think that has to do with just the changing.
And the government is already, the FDA has revised its rules for how it certifies or validates organic coming from countries overseas. So I'll leave it at that. But
well, yeah, certainly I think the premium shrunk too. So if you're a producer, you used to get a pretty fat premium if you made an organic carrot. Today, the difference between organic and non-organic is basically zero for some products. So bananas, you can buy an organic banana, it's 10 cents more than the conventional banana, right? So those premiums have been eroded over time, and I think you're right. They probably, at some point, why am I going through all this if the consumer's not willing to pay more for it? In terms of the question on which industries do well or which ones thrive and which ones suffer in a slowing economy, certainly the housing, I think everything related to the housing sector is going to slow down. The wealth effect is real. When housing prices go up, people go out and spend money. They go to Lowe's, they go to Home Depot, and they buy new appliances. We pulled forward a lot of those purchases during the pandemic. Because people had a lot of money, they were at home more. They realized, I don't want to look at that eyesore of a deck I've got in my back for this, if I'm going to be home all the time. So we pulled forward 3 or 4 years worth of those purchases to 2020 and 21. We would have done more, except for the supply chains were so out of whack. I tried to get a couch, and they said it's going to be eight months to get that couch. I was like, but it's right there. I want that couch. They said, yep, it's going to be 8 months for us to get that one to replace to send it to you. So that was the challenge I think we had back then. But most of those purchases were filled. So what are people doing now? They're like, well, I'm good. I don't need goods. I don't need to renovate my house anymore. Plus, it's more expensive. Interest rates went up, so nobody can really borrow, tap into home equity line. They don't want to do that. It's just more expensive. So I think you're going to see a pause on most things related to residential housing and real estate related stocks. You'll still see people, I think, rotate into services. So restaurants, experiences that we have not really seen come back from the pandemic. So I think the consumer may say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to buy a washing machine this year, but I do want to go to a concert, or I do want to go and have something that I've not been able to do for about 2 years as we've lived through this pandemic. So I think there's going to be some services, maybe even restaurants can have a decent period where they're able to raise prices and see people still fill the seats in the restaurant and do okay. But I think people are going to rotate maybe out of goods and services. Maybe the one bright side for retail is the U.S. dollar is fairly strong. I don't know how long that's going to last, but we import a lot of stuff, so those prices we still may be able to get some good deals on imports for some of those manufactured products. But that's what I'm watching for. Retail stocks all took a beating. Tech stocks first took a huge beating as people realized, oh right, Netflix can lose subscribers, followed by the retails. And now what are people piling into? They're going into services and they're going into energy. So that's going to be probably where you see a lot of rotation into those industries.
And I think we'd kind of add to that, going back to the geopolitics, it wasn't overhyped, but it's going to revert to the mean as globalization. There's going to be a lot more of regionalization of what used to be global ag. Russia, Ukraine, the war has made that very, very apparent. And so we are going to have to readjust to a world in which our supply chains need to be shorter, more resilient, and a lot of these things will drive it. So if food prices go up, there's less disposable income. And when food prices go up, people pull back more. So one could make the case that some of what you're talking about is actually a result of the already increased prices that we see in energy as well as in food. So there are going to be large factors that come into this. But going back to, there's another question. Given the dysfunctional state of our legislative processes over the past several administrations, we tried to be apolitical. So please read this question as apolitical. Can we solve today's food system challenges without government participation and regulation? Or will it take us to a depressing thought, getting to a point of depression-era type pain before we do? So
this is not one I want to answer first on. So yes, I think there has to be partnership. Like anytime you're trying to get somebody to do something, there need to be incentives to do that. And you can either use a carrot or a stick. So what we have been talking about a lot is those carrots. What are market-based solutions to pull forward behavior? If it's we need to have more than one person making baby formula, right? So how do we incentivize companies to invest in that? And the market can do a lot of that.
I'm going to try to find the positive. I do believe, and it's, really leveraging off a comment you made at the end, where we know that if all the constituents work together, we actually will make great strides faster. So, and we were talking about this at lunch, but we were able to come up with vaccines in a very fast collaborative effort with government, with industry, and if we could do that more with some of the food challenges, that would be a big leap forward. And we know we can. It's just we need to all sort of get on the same page. I think legislation in and of itself hasn't worked. We know that. But we're also we can't ignore it because we are, food is a subsidized commodity that the world is dependent on. So that's why you're not going to unwind that completely. Those are the only things I would add. We're back to that one.
Yep. And the government is already participating because the whole crop insurance program, the federal crop insurance program, is backed by the FCIC, the Federal Credit Insurance Corporation. And part of that is it helps keep food prices low for all of us. And what most folks don't realize is that you can have the best grower in the world with the best water, but the best soil, and they get hit by bad weather, either a heat dome or a freeze, and it's done. So the farmers are the ultimate entrepreneurs and frontiersmen and women. They put a significant amount of their net worth into buying the inputs, the genetics, the seed, the fertilizer, all of that, disease and pest management. So beginning with the potential for what their crop can be, and then everything that attacks it, less water, less disease pressure, reduces that. So it's reducing the top line, and at a certain point in time, they're getting to break even. Beyond that, it's less than break even. So there are very specific business decisions that they have to go at the same time as they're monitoring crop pricing. Some of them are good and more sophisticated, so they hedge and they do forward contracts. but they do forward contracts for half of it because if prices go up, they want to participate. So they are, as they get to larger growers, they're becoming more sophisticated, but the government is already a part of that. Because if you're a grower and you strike out 3 years in a row, you're bankrupt. And we can't afford to have those growers leave the system. It's not traditional economics where you're like market entrants and exits. Once they leave, they're gone. You very rarely have somebody from a city saying, hey, I want to go and go farming. So that supply has to remain, and that's why it's still in. So here's another question. How important is reducing food waste? How will it be monetized if it can be? And we'll just mention a statistic. About 30% of food in the developed world is wasted. 30%. Most of it after it gets to the home and the refrigerator. In the developing world, 30% is wasted or lost before it gets to the grocery store because they don't have storage and supply chain logistics, all of that. So how should food waste be looked at?
Well, I do think there's a lot of solutions for food waste, and we've made great strides in thinking about byproducts. We track a lot of them in my platform where we're taking spent grain that's been used to make beer and we're making it flour and it's being utilized and products are being created around it. I think it's also good to know that there has been a lot of focus around through several associations on this challenge within North America. And at the farm gate, there's also a lot of technology that is being deployed through various either government associations or others to help either putting coolers closer to the field so they can harvest and produce like your papayas and stuff don't rot, things like that. I think this is a very solvable problem. I think in the past we've looked at food waste as something that went into our animal feeds and things like that. But now we're looking at higher value upcycling because it's just good business. The best thing about food waste is it's good capitalism to not waste and use more. It's just cheaper than having to go back and grow more. So I think that's going to drive more change, faster adoption of change, because it costs too much money. The cost of waste. Even as we talked about, experientials will go up. So restaurants have technology that they are using, a company like Winnow, or I can list out several of these startups who are able to measure what gets consumed, use artificial insemination to actually determine how much they should produce that day because of the historical patterns of flow. So that, the best thing to happen in a restaurant, we don't have that on the menu anymore. That means there's no waste. It may not be great for us as a consumer, but the reality is that usually the person sitting in that seat is going to say, you know what? Okay, well, I can't have the sea bass. I'll have but they're usually not they're not picking up and walking out. So as long as you give them a good experience, you can avoid the waste. I also think that the consumer in general is much more conscious. It's been an education. It's probably been one that's taken 10 years, but they're much more aware. We had a discussion last night at dinner. I think twice about buying the big bag of broccoli at Costco because I stopped buying it because it went bad too fast. I couldn't consume that much broccoli, even family of 4. I like broccoli, not every day, 3 meals a day. So it's changed my behavior because that had a cost to me. But I think more and more of the consumers are thinking that way. And that's been a change in what we've seen over the last 10 years. Chris?
I think one of the pieces of technology that can help this problem is the indoor ag in locally produced food, where you're reducing the food miles. That not only is there a lower likelihood that the lettuce that only has to come across the city or maybe be distributed regionally is going to waste. It's also going to have higher nutritional content and taste better, honestly. So indoor is part of the solution to this, as well as some of the other technologies. And there's a lot of startups looking at this problem set a lot, and I think it's a good place to focus some energy and capital.
Anybody who's interested in any of those companies or want to buy upcycled products, happy to spend a lot of time talking about that afterwards.
Well, I certainly agree with the other two speakers. I tend to think my brain goes to like economic problems when I think like, well, what is the real problem here? It's that food companies are trying to maximize the number of units that they sell, and they discount that product in order to sell more units. It's a classic supply-demand equilibrium thing. And we as consumers say like, oh, that's a good deal. That's a good deal. Wow, look at that. I can buy that whole thing of broccoli for just $1 more than I can that little thing of broccoli. Even though all we need is the little thing of broccoli, we as consumers we like a deal. And so I think that's something that we've got to find a way to change, either through consumer education or food companies actually taking an active role in changing how they think about, instead of maybe maximization, it's optimization. I think Sarah said that at the beginning. It's one of my favorite things to think about as well. We need less maximization and maybe more optimization in some of these problems. And we could probably reduce food waste and increase profits simultaneously. But we got to break that consumer mindset of, oh, it's a good deal. Oh, I want the good deal. You're actually spending more. And so I don't think as a consumer, I always think that way, that, oh yeah, I should probably consume less and I'll actually save money. No, I think it's a good deal, so I should buy more of it. So through consumer education, outreach, all those kind of things, as well as I think food companies trying to change practices and try some things, which is getting cheaper to do now. A lot of these food companies had a very lengthy production chain. They learned during the pandemic, I can't do that anymore. So there's a lot of investment in just-in-time inventory management. This is where if you had food grown more locally, just-in-time makes a lot of sense for food delivery. So when we get to that stage of our food system, we could do more experiments on, hey, what if I change my packaging size? That doesn't cost me a tremendous amount. Did it change how much was wasted, how much was thrown away, how many consumers bought that size? So I think we have some opportunities to really try through experimentation, try some things, and let these food companies work out a better solution to the big bag of broccoli.
I think the other thing is the more food waste gets expensive, the biggest thing that we see, especially at the retail side, is that a lot of food just gets thrown away. I mean, it is still horrifying, but there is technology that would allow you to say, okay, well, this milk has 2 days left. We're gonna reduce it to $1 or $2 because that's still income that is not lost, and will likely get consumed. And I think that when we have that more dynamic pricing models, where a lot of the Krogers and those folks are trying these technologies, we will also start to see a big decline in food waste.
Thank you. That's a very powerful point. And our firm is partnering with the group that is looking at taking imperfect produce and food waste before it gets wasted and providing it to food banks and having a conduit from a supply chain perspective to be able to do that. There's so many other topics we can cover today. There's caloric versus nutritive. There's overall health. We are the most powerful and affluent nation, and civilizationally, arguably, at the zenith compared to other civilizations that have existed before. And yet, we are trying to solve some of the basic problems that civilization has dealt with since the beginning of time. We have food deserts, and we still have children in our cities or towns and villages that are struggling with getting the right nutritive content. So these are social equity issues that we need to think about, and in the board room, we have the best capacity to be able to guide the discussion towards action. So hopefully today's session has been informative. I think some of us will be around for a little while after if you'd like to have questions or exchange contact information. And like to really thank Sarah for having helped facilitate bringing us together. We had not met before this, except I think Ann and I happened to be at the same conference last week. So with that, back to you, Sarah.